This is Kenny with another edition of the Yak with Mac. Welcome back. This week we got to talk to Gordie Tamayo, Communications Manager for Care, about the importance of building relationships through great communication. Listen in, leaders. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Yak with Mac. This is Kenny, and as I say all the time, prepared to be inspired, but I have to tell you, today, also prepare to learn. Leaders, listen in, lean in, as they say, right? Lean in a little bit and listen, because this man is going to drop some great knowledge on you, and we're going to really cover one form of leadership in a big way today. So, leaders, before I bring Gordie in, this is the place to come to. We want to inspire you. We want to encourage you. We just want you to be better influencers so that you could be great leaders out there. Remember, influence is the key word. You just can't be walking around telling people what to do anymore, right? And we're going to talk about a lot about communication today. So that's going to be a good thing. All right, let me get to my very, very special guest. I'd like to introduce Gordie Tamayo. He's the communication manager for Care in the Central Region. Gordie, welcome, man. It is great to have you.
Appreciate it. Got the virtual claps going on here.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And so I got to know Gordie. Gosh, it's been a couple of months now, and Gordie reached out and invited me to a great event that him and his team was doing. And he's just this great guy who does so much for his team and is so invested into leadership. And so it's going to be great to have him, because again, we're talking about a communications manager, right? So we probably understand there's certain things that he has to send out and stuff like that. But I could tell you that this guy, when it comes to leaders communicating properly, is going to have some great advice. So Gordie, you know where I'd like to start? Let's let the audience really get to know you a little bit. And you can walk through as far back as you'd like to go through your career journey and how you landed in the spot of a communications manager.
Sure. Yeah, I think with many people, when the question is asked about your journey and where you're at, there's so many pieces that you could end up sharing. You're going to miss some of those. And so, I'm trying to think through what's the most pertinent. But when it comes to T-Mobile, I started out like many on the front lines, taking phone calls. Excuse me. And that was the case for me for actually quite a few years. I want to say I was taking calls
Wow.
for about 8 years. And
Wow. Wow.
and it was interesting because my background was very different from just taking phone calls. Prior to T-Mobile, I was involved in the entertainment sector, and I used to be a booking agent, a concert promoter. I kind of did brand management for various artists, and so did a lot of grassroots marketing type of stuff, and so that was kind of my forte. That was kind of my niche. Didn't quite find that opportunity necessarily, taking phone calls at T-Mobile, but it's what brought home the bacon, right? It's what was paying the bills, took care of the family once I started having a family. And so, I really learned a lot about just talking with people, um, communicating with people, right? It's pretty huge. And I think there's a lot to
Yeah.
be learned in that space there. But so I did that for quite a few years. And, fortunately, I was able to build some pretty cool relationships along the way, which is monumental. I think for anybody that's made some major moves in their life and their career, relationships are a key component to that. And so
Hmm.
I always stress that as well. It's not so much about networking as it is about building relationships with people, two different things. And I was fortunate enough to build some really key relationships with people that just looked for opportunities that they could open the door for me. They recognized certain skill sets that I brought to the table. They seen that I had a knack for certain things. One of those building things out of nothing, constructing things out of nothing. And so they were able to put me to work in that space when an opportunity arose. And big shout out to Curtis Bills being a big proponent and champion for
Mm.
me throughout all these years. And so that's kind of where the ball really started rolling, I would say, through gaining certain champions in your corner, you'll tend to see that those people go to bat for you. They advocate for you when you got some key players on your team. And that's what I benefited from. I was able to take on various stretch assignments that exposed me to a broader group of people, stretched me and challenged my skill sets that I was already had under my belt, but then stretched them as well, gained some new ones along the way. And that kind of kept growing. It landed to another position where I was able to um, develop those skill sets as well in a training role, and then that kind of moved into a communication specialist role. And all along the road there, I was picking up and developing new skill sets until, most recently that turned into a communications manager role for the central region. And so that's where I'm at now, working for the central region, and it's been great. I'm still learning stuff every day, and I'm one of those guys who never stops learning. I love to learn. I love to read. I love to study. I love to talk to people. I love to learn from other people and what they do. I'm a constant just vessel, if you would, looking for more, that we can absorb and I can apply, because nobody knows it all, and I'm a firm
No
believer of
doubt.
that. Nobody knows it all.
Oh, that is awesome, man. What a spectacular journey. I love that. Starting right there on the front lines. I
Hmm.
got to go back though. You said some things that really resonated with me. And talk a little bit more about this. You said there's a big difference between relationship building and networking.
Hmm.
Tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah. So I think very often when we think of connecting with people, very often we can look at it from the lens of, I'm going to connect with people because there's something in it for me. And I
Mm,
and I look at that from
mm,
a networking component. When you think of like going to networking events, right? The traditional networking events where everybody takes their business card and they're handing it to somebody with the intention of making sure I get a number if I give a number, type of thing, right?
mm-hmm.
But when I
Mm.
think of relationship building, I'm looking at it from the lens of, what can I do for them? What am I bringing to the table, even if nothing comes back to me in return? How can I help and assist that person? The natural byproduct of me bringing something to the table that assists somebody else is that eventually an opportunity opens up for me. And so that's the benefit there. But when we look at it from the lens of, I just want to get to know this person because I think they're a cool person. I think what they have to offer is phenomenal. I think the skills that they bring to the table are great. I want to learn from them. And if there's something I can do to help you with what you're trying to do, even better. Let me help you get to where you're going. And I'm not necessarily asking for anything in return. I just see that there's potential in what you're doing. There's greatness in you. And if I can add value to that, then I think that's phenomenal. And I did my job for the day. And so I look at it from that perspective.
Man, I love that. And I'll say this because I know you won't. That's exactly what you did with me. And
Hmm.
which is why I'm so happy to have the spotlight on you today,
Hmm.
because it was just about, hey, how can I serve you? It was such a servant leadership part that I sensed that you had right away, and I don't sense it anymore. I knew it almost right away, but that is such a great distinction. And I think there's a time and place for networking, as you just said,
Sure.
but that relationship building is really the most powerful thing, one of the most powerful things I think you can do for your career. But
Hmm.
you're not even doing it for your career. You're
Hmm.
just serving people. And I love that.
Yeah.
You said that you also said that along the way, you've had some champions in your corner. Talk a
Hmm.
little bit more about that, and what are some specific things that a few people may have done to help move you along and help lift you up?
Yeah. When I think of champions in our corner and I think of what a leader can do for somebody, one of the best things that a leader can do for somebody is take them to a place that they would never have been able to get to by themselves. And sometimes that means taking a risk on somebody. Sometimes that means being able to see and recognize something within that person, whether that's a talent, whether that's a particular skill set, whether that's just a knack for doing something, and creating those opportunities where that person can then be put to the test. Even if it means that they fail a little bit, right? Like, you give them that opportunity to do that in a safe atmosphere. And so
Mhm.
when I think of champions in my corner, I think of those people that have done that. They have opened opportunities and doors that I wouldn't have had access to before. They introduced me to people that I wouldn't have been able to have met before. They recognized skill sets in myself that were dormant at the time and maybe I didn't even know existed, and they put them into the test and allowed that to be exhibited and see what would come out of it. And they were able just to help refine myself to become a better version of who I was, and even discover things about myself that I didn't even know. And so I think that as you grow as a leader, one of those things that becomes apparent because of experience, right? And with experience sometimes comes a little bit of wisdom. And so you
Mhm.
learn to decipher these things within other people. And so you can become a champion for somebody else by saying, hey, they remind me a lot of what I was trying to do. They just didn't know how to do it. So they might have had a particular skill set, but they didn't know how to apply it to their life and how to make
Mm,
it living and breathing into something tangible. And so when you
mm.
see that and you provide an opportunity for them, all of a sudden you've just given that person hope. And we all know what hope does to people. It's fuel for their soul, and it moves them into action, and it creates something inside of them that makes them want more out of life. It desires excellence, right? And it pushes them
Yeah.
for excellence. And so that's what I think of with or with champions, I should say.
That's awesome. Hope is fuel for the soul. I love that.
Mhm.
Leaders, please take that. Take that. That is just, it's so true. And we just never know who we can inspire and touch just with a good word every day, or just saying, hey, you know what? I believe in you. And
Mhm.
and let's take this a little further now. And let me show you a couple of things that's going to help you along the way. I
Mhm.
love that.
Yeah.
Any lessons learned from your previous career? So I'm sure there's a ton of lessons from the 8 years of
Sure.
taking care of customers, but your previous career was very interesting. Knocking on doors to get acts booked and things like that.
Mhm.
Any lessons learned from that? I imagine that was probably a lot of hours, probably a lot of even odd hours, off hours,
Oh,
weekends, nights, things like that.
yeah. Yeah, most definitely. It's one of those things where you don't know exactly who you're going to run into. You don't know what that relationship is going to be 10 years down the road. And so I learned a lot about really just respecting people for where they're at and understanding that like everybody's different, right? Everybody comes from a different space, a different walk, a different background. And how do you connect with people in a way that allows them to say, hey, regardless of our view, maybe in particular arenas of life, like we have this commonality in place, right? And I've witnessed, excuse me, I've witnessed so many times where 10 years down the road, a relationship that I had built before comes up and is needed for a particular project, or it's needed for a particular venture that you're after. And it's amazing just how that stuff comes back full circle. And there's a good saying out there that some people may know, and that's that a good name is desired above great riches. And I'm reminded of
Wow.
that when you are living your life in a way where you're leaving a stamp on the planet, that people can look to you, they can see you, and they can see what you've planted on the planet is something worthwhile and worthy to sustain itself over generations. Then they want to do business with you, they want to talk with you, they want to chop shop with you, they want to pick your brain, etc. And just learning how to build relationships over life. So that's a big one right there.
No doubt. No doubt. I love that. I love that. And, it says a lot also about guarding and protecting your reputation,
Hmm.
because that's sometimes all we have, right? Is
Yeah.
our reputation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so let's shift gears a little bit. Now we've got some really good insight into who you are and what's landed you in this spot. But I would suspect a lot of folks that are going to watch this may not know what a communication manager actually does every day. So
Sure.
walk us a little bit through that, and then I really want to jump into how can leaders communicate better these days. So
Mhm.
walk us through first, what does a communication manager do every day?
Yeah, great question. So I want to say that depending on industry and depending on team, that may differ somewhat.
Yeah.
For myself, I can tell you that one of the big things that we're challenged to do is to connect people together, and communications is one of those ways, is one of those things. And there's a variety of ways that you do that, because you're connecting leaders to their audiences, you're connecting audiences to one another, but you also have to make sure that in the midst of doing that, the vision that is initially being casted is the same vision across the board, and it's continually being casted. Because if you have one team in place but five different visions for what is trying to be built or trying to be assembled, it's really easy for things to get a little haywire. And so one of the big things that we focus on is making sure that the vision of how people come together and how this team is assembled is continually being constructed, and it's continually being conveyed in ways that people can manage and receive it. We know that not everybody learns the same, right? We live
Mhm.
in a world and where there's people, and where there's people there's differences, and people learn differently. Sometimes that's audibly, right? Sometimes that's visually, sometimes that's tactically, right? Sometimes that's them needing to just sit and absorb something and doesn't hit until 5 days later. But you got to realize that the patterns in people are different, and so we utilize that understanding to say, hey, I might be able to best communicate with this person with an email. We know email is not always the most functional way of reaching people in some ways, right? Sometimes it is. But then you might say, okay, this particular audience, they might need something a little bit more visually appealing. How do I do that? At the same time, that ties into what are we trying to portray with the people that are influencing this mass population, right? So for myself to kind of, I guess, fine tune a little bit more what I'm trying to get at is that I look at the people that I serve, the people that I work with, as a little bit of almost like PNR, right? I look at them as clientele, if you would, and my job is to help position them in a way where the people that they engage with, whether publicly facing or internal, they know who this person is, right? People will follow who they know, right, and who they respect. And so it's a little bit tricky sometimes, but the goal when you're helping a leader specifically and somebody that's influencing a mass amount of people is you want people to understand that person and feel like they actually know the person, right?
Mm,
Because all too
mm.
often, I mean, you can have just talk, let's think celebrities, for example, some celebrities are really good at this, right? Or main social influencers where they share a lot about their life, right? Sometimes a little bit too much, right? And
Yeah.
and it's kind of like that, but what happens is people they gain this affinity for people because they feel like they know them all of a sudden now, right? And so I think
Yeah.
there's a fine line between how you play that, and depending on the persons that you're working with, that can change a little bit. But my job is a constant juggling act between trying to figure out ways to better communicate between people in the region and leaders to their people.
Wow. So it sounds like that keeps you probably very, very busy, and you're probably constantly thinking about different ways to
Hmm.
communicate. You said a lot of things there. There's one I'm going to touch on now because I think that's a good segue into what my next question is for you, which is how can leaders communicate a little bit better? You mentioned how you realize thoroughly every single day that people learn and like to be communicated with in different ways. So if I'm a leader, whether I'm in a call center, whether I'm in a retail store or anywhere, how do I know? What are some things that I need to do to figure out how should I be communicating to my team?
Hmm. Yeah, great question. Right off the bat, I would say one of the foundational things to ask oneself is, do I know my people? Right? Because
Mm,
like we got to know our people in order to know how best to communicate to them and how they're going to best receive it, and not just how they're going to receive it, but if they're going to even receive it in some small way, shape, and form, are they going to be able to digest that and then be able to apply that to their lives, right? Because if they're receiving something from you, but it doesn't cause some kind of change or some kind of action, then it's not being impactful the way that it was supposed to. So it comes back to knowing your audience, knowing your people. And sometimes that might be hard for people to admit to, that we don't know our people as well as we think we do. And so,
mhm,
being able to ask those questions and take pulse checks with your people, with even the leaders that lead other people, depending on the structure of the leadership. Um, but that part's one of the most fundamental things. Next, I would say, is using the people within your teams, right? I think too often many leaders think that they got to know it all, like that they
mm,
reach some spot in their career or life or perhaps age or whatever it is, and this false sense of thinking that we've arrived in some way, shape, or form, and none of us arrive, right? We can get really, really good at a particular arena of our lives, but we can all too often neglect those people around us that would be phenomenal resources and maybe even better at it than ourselves, but we don't tap into them. And so
mm,
I'm a big fan of finding these what I dub anomalies, and finding these people in our lives that they have these phenomenal ways about doing certain things and tapping into those resources to best get what you need out of what you're trying to do for your teams. So if you have a huge overarching vision for your team, one, you don't have to do it on, neither do you want to do it all yourself, right? That's a pretty single track view of what everybody needs. And like we mentioned earlier, everybody learns differently, everybody needs something different. So tapping into the resources around you to get different perspectives, different insight, different tools and ways to communicate with your people. You'd be surprised at what your people know. And we don't know because we don't ask. And when we
mm.
ask, I would say we ask amiss because we ask for the wrong motives and intentions. And so really tapping into your people.
Yeah, that's awesome because and that comes with that mindset every day of being able to utilize everybody that's around you.
Hmm.
But we sometimes as leaders feel like we got to be on an island by ourselves,
Right.
and I can do this. So I love that. Those are two really specific, great pieces of advice, right? Knowing your people and then utilizing the people around you that'll help you communicate a little bit better. And so if I'm a leader and I'm constantly using email or text messages, and I'll just share this real quick.
Hmm.
I was with I was texting someone the other day and they hadn't answered. And I felt like this, Gordie, after because they called me after a day and they said, "Hey Kenny, why didn't you just pick up the phone and call me? I wasn't looking at my phone. Why didn't you just call me?
Uh-huh.
And I could have answered it a lot quicker." And they were so right. And I'm usually good at that. I can
Hmm.
usually, but I totally missed it this time. So if you're a leader and you're using one form of communication, how do you then, aside from these two things, which are very specific, how do you
Hmm.
break that? Because this leader may have grown up just text messaging and things like that.
Sure.
How do you break that? How do you get into really good communication habits to use the full suite of what we might have?
Yeah. Well, one thing is that we have to remember that we are in a much different era than we were 10 years ago. And
Wow.
so we often will cling to what we believe has always worked for us. And
Hmm.
it's that old adage that people fear change, right? Which they do. People fear change because it's uncomfortable. It goes against the typical routines that you might have established for your life. And so you don't realize that while you're still trying to operate in a way that worked for you 10 years ago, the rest of the world's moved on to something else. And
Hmm.
so that also connects back to what I was mentioning earlier about utilizing the resources of your team, because maybe that is an area that's what you're used to and that's what you know. But you could tap into somebody else in your network, in your sphere, right, in your team that understands very well how to communicate through social, right? How to communicate visually through graphics, how to communicate through, a podcast type of format. And so there's these different ways of leveraging how to communicate. We just have to be willing to take a risk and take a jump at that. And most people won't change unless they see somebody else kind of leading the charge and doing that. And what better way to start than with the leader making the jump themselves and doing that, right?
No question. No question. That is awesome advice. One last question for you. Um, and so sometimes I see leaders that try to overly communicate and it comes off as disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
How do I avoid that trap? Because sometimes, I see leaders looking for splashy quotes and things like that.
Sure.
Nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I read a quote from a leader one time and I'm like, that's not them. That's not even close to them,
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
not what they kind of stand for. And I didn't mean that in a negative way at all.
Sure. Yeah.
But how do we avoid falling into that trap? Because there's so many resources out there that we can pull from. How do we
Mm-hmm.
stay true to being authentic to ourselves as we're communicating?
Yeah. Well, a big part, I'm glad you brought that up because I was actually thinking through what we were going to talk about today, not really knowing exactly. And one of the things that came to my mind was being authentic as a leader. And all too often, we can look to the world around us and we're looking at others that we might look up to, others that we might admire, others that maybe are just making some moves. And all of a sudden, we think we need to do exactly what they're doing in order to get ahead or in order to build a name or build a brand for ourselves. But you just proved it a moment ago. People can spot fake, right? And eventually it comes out, right? Eventually the truth will be revealed. Truth always comes out and gets revealed. And so there's really no use in trying to be somebody that you're not. I can't remember who said it, but it reminds me of the saying that, you ought to be yourself because there's not enough of you, but there's already enough of everybody else, right? Be
Yeah,
yourself. And
yeah,
so being true to yourself is like, why would you want to be anybody else, right? If that's not going to get you eventually in the long term where you want to be anyways, what's the point of trying to fake it and trying to get there by another means? And so I would say to be bold enough to stand by your convictions and your ideals, no matter what the culture is saying, no matter what the times are saying, no matter what your peers are saying, no matter how quirky you may sound or how different you may look, etc. We are all going to give an account to that anyways in one way, shape, or form on this planet. And so I'm going to say that you just got to do what you know you got to do. And sometimes that's a little tough because by nature, we're human and we like to please people. We want to be liked. We want
Yeah.
people to respect us or admire us. But when it all boils down to it, like, eventually that fades, that changes with time, and we just got to do what we should do, and that's be authentic.
Man, that is outstanding. So leaders, hey, you've got some great communication tips here from someone who does it for a living day in and day out. I do have one last question for you though.
Mhm.
Is that an Atlanta Braves hat that I see in the background there?
It is. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
just saying, I'm a Mets fan, huge Mets fan,
Yeah.
and we're battling this week. I mean, the Braves
Sure.
just like spanked them last night, so
Uh-huh.
hopefully the Mets can take these next two and put the Braves in their rearview mirror.
Yeah.
But the
Good
Braves have had
luck.
so much success over the years. It's just, I'm as a Met fan, I'm just like I always expect, another shoe to drop, but.
Sure.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So, but anyway, man. Hey, listen, Gordie, this has been unbelievable, man. I can't thank you enough. I know how busy you are and the responsibilities that you have. I only know a little bit of them, but I know that they're very vast and wide-ranging in the things you do for your team. So, my last question will be, can I get you back on the podcast? I'd actually like to go even a little bit deeper with verbal
Mhm.
communication and stuff like that with you. Would that be
Definitely.
cool? Maybe in another
I'd
month or
love
two?
I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, folks, this has been Kenny and Gordie with the Yak with Mac. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll talk to you next week. Gordie, thank you, man.
Appreciate it, Ken. Thank you.